Hey everyone, it's Sevy. Punching his way to you is Luka, who has finally found his shirt and is no longer just a mystery dude on a light cone. Whether you're interested in this Fight Club champion to get in the ring with Kafka's dot teams, or simply because you like his flaming drip, I've brought this guide to help you learn how to build and play him. We'll discuss his kit and traces, Eidolons, best relic and light cone builds, team synergies, and gameplay tips. This is also the fourth guide of my damage over time or dot related videos. If you're not that familiar with how dot works, I recommend checking out my basic explainer to dots, as well as my Sampo and Kafka guides where I discuss a lot of relevant dot synergies there. Links in the description below. With that, let's get ready to rumble.
The tournament's starting? Great! Let me get warmed up.
Luka is a 4-star Physical Nihility character that specializes in inflicting bleed damage and increasing enemy vulnerability. His release with Kafka is very apt as he becomes a good candidate to slot into her dot teams, taking on the role of a debuffer, effective skill point generator, and breaker against physical weak enemies. Let's go over his individual traces to break down how his kit works, how good he is, and some caveats to consider. Starting with Luka's skill, it deals physical damage to a single target with a 100% base chance of inflicting bleed on the enemy for 3 turns. The bleed base damage is a flat 24% of the enemy's max HP, but note that it's capped by a percent of Luka's attack, so don't expect to deal a quarter of a boss enemy's HP just like that. Leveling up his skill increases the base damage cap, so if you want his normal bleed to be more painful, increase his skill level and stack his attack. Then through Luka's talent, we get his fighting will stacking mechanic, a core component of managing his gameplay. Using his skill and basic attack creates 1 stack of fighting will each, which maxes out at 4 stacks. When initiating battle, Luka possesses 1 stack at the start. Then if you have at least 2 stacks, his basic attack becomes enhanced. This enhanced basic attack consumes 2 stacks of fighting will. It first deals 3 punch hits, then he finishes it off with a stronger final uppercut. What's special about this uppercut is that it immediately triggers a portion of the original damage of any bleed status applied on the enemy without consuming its duration. This gives his bleed more opportunities to deal damage outside of the enemy's turn. It's sort of like Kafka's skill detonation, but only for bleed. Even better, either the normal bleed dot applied by his skill or a bleed from a physical break can be triggered, and if both are simultaneously present, then both will also trigger for even more bleed damage. With that, you want to try as much as possible to keep a bleed status on your target enemy to maximize Luka's enhanced basic attacks. It also gives you a good reason to partially build him for break effect and capitalize on a break playstyle to make his detonations, as well as Kafka's, more powerful. Note though that regardless if it's the normal or enhanced version, his basic attack will still regenerate only 20 energy. Moving on to his ultimate, casting it gives him 2 fighting will stacks and packs a heavy punch to a single target. But more importantly, it has a 100% base chance of inflicting a damage vulnerability debuff that increases all damage they receive for 3 turns. This vulnerability affects both non-dot and dot sources, so that will be very helpful in boosting overall team damage, especially in single target boss fights. It also makes him a little bit more flexible as a viable unit in non-dot teams. However, be aware of its higher than usual energy cost of 130. As such, Luka's energy regeneration may introduce some challenges in maintaining the uptime of this debuff, and this will depend on how fast or slow the enemy is relative to Luka. We'll discuss this further in a later section on his rotations. For his technique, it initiates battle to deal toughness damage to all physical weak enemies while also dealing additional physical damage on 1 random enemy with a chance to inflict bleed. This also generates 1 additional fighting will stack. Then let's quickly go through Ascension bonus abilities and stat bonus traces. His A2 ability dispels 1 debuff on a target enemy by using his skill. This is a very nice support utility to help you better control buffs on the battlefield, especially to get rid of annoying or threatening enemy buffs. A4 lets him gain 3 energy for every fighting will stack obtained. This is another valuable upgrade in order to address his high energy cost and shorten his ult recharge time. If you gain a stack while you have 4 max stacks, this energy gain will not trigger. This incentivizes you to be more conscious of his stacks gained and lost. Then A6 makes his enhanced basic attack hits have a 50% fixed chance to deal 1 additional hit, letting him deal more damage. For his minor stat bonuses, he gets EHR and attack, which are very much needed, and some defense for more survivability. When leveling up his traces, prioritize his ultimate and skill levels since they comprise the core of his kit. But you also want to level up his talent to increase his bleed detonation damage, and even if he'll do a lot of basic attacks, its value is more from the bleed detonation, so you don't have to prioritize his basic attack trace as much. On the topic of his rotation and energy, he generally assumes a skill point neutral or positive rotation. The bleed on his skill lasts for 3 turns, and his basic attack can detonate bleeds, so there's much less incentive to spam his skill. However, the more you use Luka's basic attacks instead of his skill, then the less energy he'll regenerate, and the longer it'll take to cast his ultimate again. The potential issue of that is his vulnerability debuff might not be as consistently maintained if the enemy is fast enough. By default, his ult is ready in 5 turns without extra ERR. You just want to manage his stacks well to avoid overcapping and wasting his A4 energy passive. But if you want to reduce his energy recharge time by at least 1 turn, he will need an ERR rope, energy adding equipment, and or external energy sources. Before the tutorial mission starts allows Luka to have a 4-turn rotation without any additional ERR, assuming the target's defense is reduced for 3 of his attacks. And if you really want to, adding an ERR rope with his light cone makes 3-turn ults possible. So to summarize his main pros and cons, he applies a vulnerability debuff on enemies while also being able to dispel buffs. He's also a natural skill point generator with his basic attack focused playstyle, and he's a good sub DPS thanks to being able to inflict and detonate bleeds, plus he can break physical weak enemies for added bleed dot, giving him some break effect build potential. However, one caveat is his higher than average energy cost, which causes him to have a relatively long ult recharge time. This can be alleviated by relying on external energy sources or using an ERR rope or modifying your rotation to allow for more skill casts. His abilities are also exclusively single target oriented. This will have no problem in single boss scenarios, but in AoE content he will struggle to juggle his buffs and damage and will instead have to depend on other teammates to quickly clear enemy mobs. Now let's take a look at Luka's Eidolons, all of which are actually quite helpful improvements on an already good E0 base kit. E1 gives Luka a 15% damage bonus that lasts for 2 turns by attacking a bleeding target. It's a straightforward boost that you'll want to maintain as much as possible for maximum damage. E2 makes his skill generate 1 additional fighting will stack when you attack a physical weak enemy. It's a quality of life improvement to his stacking time and energy generation from the Ascension 4 ability. E3 increases his skill and talent levels. E4 makes every fighting will stack grant a 5% attack bonus, also another damage increasing Eidolon. E5 increases his ultimate and basic attack levels, and E6 makes his enhanced basic attack's final hit trigger 8% of current bleed damage. This can stack depending on how many direct hits he executed. By default, he hits 3 times, which gives a baseline 24% trigger multiplier. This is an impactful Eidolon since it grants him another means of triggering bleeds instantly. His talent already does something similar, but with E6, then he can capitalize all the more on his normal and break bleeds, making him an even deadlier dot unit. Now onto his relic build, starting with his stats. For the body piece, you can either go for EHR if you're still quite lacking in his EHR target, but if you can fulfill it through other sources like substats or equipment, then go with attack instead. For his feat piece, I highly recommend speed to cycle through his turns faster. That will allow faster energy regeneration, fighting will stacking, debuff application, help hit higher speed breakpoints and planar set requirements, and can also help him break enemies and detonate his bleeds sooner. Attack is an okay alternative, particularly if you can compensate for his speed needs through other sources. For his planar sphere, physical damage is your best pick, but attack is an okay temporary alternative. Then for the link rope, here's where you have 3 options to consider depending on your preference. Attack, break effect, and ERR. Attack is pretty self-explanatory as it's a straightforward increase in normal damage and dot. On the other hand, if you're looking to capitalize on the potential of break bleed dots, then break effect is a strong alternative too. His high energy cost does make it quite a challenge to recharge, so if you want to reduce his ult recharge time by 1 turn, then go for an ERR rope. Depending on how fast Luka and the enemy are, the added ERR could help you reduce the downtime of his vulnerability debuff. Then for substats, prioritize getting EHR as needed, speed, and attack. Break effect rolls are very welcome too, since break blades can be quite strong. Crit stats are still okay to get, although lower priority, while effect resistance rolls aren't bad to help prevent CC debuffs. For his sets, you have these 4-piece set options. The champion set for its physical damage and stacking attack bonuses, the musketeer set for attack, speed, and basic attack bonuses, and the thief set for stronger breaks. The champion and musketeer set are universally good for any combat scenario, but the thief set has strong potential if you can can effectively utilize Luka's break playstyle. But two-piece combos of physical damage, attack, speed, and break effect are still very competitive and allow for more flexibility in choosing good pieces. For the planar set, the Space Healing Station is a straightforward top option for its 24% attack bonus. If you still want more EHR instead, the Pan-Galactic set gives a mix of EHR and an attack bonus based on the user's EHR. An alternative set is the Fleet of the Ageless, which is in the same cavern as Space Healing Station, so you might end up farming a good set. It offers slightly lower personal damage, but buffs the entire team's attack to balance it out. This also stacks even with multiple users in the team. Finally, Talia set can be a great option to lean into his break playstyle. However, the speed requirement for the second bonus is very high, so if you can't hit it, this is less recommended. You can hybridize the break effect and attack build through getting a mix from set bonuses and relic stats, which allows him to be flexible enough and output good performance in both scenarios. Ultimately, the right main stats and substats matter a lot as well, so choose among your available best quality pieces. Now let's go through Luka's light cone recommendations. If you've watched my previous build guides on Kafka and Sampo, most of the points will be very similar with some minor additions. You have two top free-to-play 4-star options with different benefits. Formata helps both his break and normal damage and is already a great baseline choice. You just need to pair him with Kafka, Serval, and or Sampo, who will apply and maintain shock or wind shear on enemies to trigger the light cone's damage buff. The other is before the tutorial mission starts. It gives a lot of EHR to single-handedly almost max out his EHR requirement so you can focus on other stats in your relics, and it regenerates 8 extra energy when you attack defense-reduced enemies. However, the issue with that is if no one on the team applies a defense debuff, then this is practically non-existent, and you lose a bigger portion of what makes this light cone potentially great on him. If that's too conditional, then there are other more flexible alternatives. Eyes of the Prey gives a lot of EHR and dot bonus. It's a solid option to address a lot of his EHR needs while enhancing his normal bleed dot. Resolution Shine's Pearls of Sweat is his shirtless signature light cone. While it doesn't have damage bonuses for the user, it amplifies the entire team's damage output with a defense shred, making this a team-wide damage boost. The chance to apply also triggers per hit, and thankfully, Luka's basic attack hits a lot, so even the low superimposition base chance won't be as big of an issue. In the Name of the World is also a good option if you manage to pull one with high 5-star base stats and decent damage boost, but keep in mind that the EHR and attack bonuses only apply during his skill attack. And as usual, Good Night and Sleep Well is a top option for maximum personal damage and strongly competes even against 5-star light cones when you have it at a high superimposition level. Finally, let's discuss Luka's team synergies. Since I've already discussed a lot about dot team building in my previous Sampo and Kafka guides, I'll avoid repeating a lot of the basic pointers from there. So I'll just focus more on summarizing specific synergies that Luka brings. Luka is a natural fit in a Kafka dot team. He could be the only other dot applicator paired with Kafka, or this team can consist of 3 main dot units. With his vulnerability debuff, he can amplify all forms of damage regardless if they're dot or not, making him have both damage dealing and supportive utilities. Your main concern will be ensuring his bleed and debuff are consistently applied to make everyone's damage, and especially Kafka's detonations, as painful as possible. This is also where his break playstyle can shine by strategically making him deal the breaking hit to apply a break bleed dot. Because of how bleed scales, break bleeds are especially strong against enemies with high toughness and HP pools. And now, rather than just waiting for the enemy's turn to trigger the break bleed, both him and Kafka can repeatedly detonate it for massive physical damage before it expires. Of course, he can still be comped with other dot DPSs in a Kafka-less team, but undoubtedly, his dot potential simply excels with Mommy Kafka. Outside of a dot team, he is viable enough to take a flex slot as your team's debuffer, especially if you're fighting physical weak enemies in a single target scenario. Again, his vulnerability debuff universally enhances all forms of damage, and even non-dot teams can still appreciate his skill point generation, buff dispel, and other support utilities. For example, a monophysical team can slot in Sushang as your main DPS, Natasha as your healer, and Silverwolf as another debuffer, weakness implanter, and to help break quantum weak enemies faster too. With another physical breaker on the team, Luka's detonation can still trigger their break bleeds on top of his own normal bleed. If you're thinking of playing him as a main DPS in a hyper carry team, then just be aware that his non-dot damage scaling isn't that stellar, and he still leans more into applying his normal and break bleeds and detonating them with his enhanced basic attacks. And that's it for this Luka guide. Let me know in the comments what you think of this wildfire fighter and his bleed-inducing abilities. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!